We're on.
Oh, great.
Oh. Hello. This is the Liberal Reform live stream where we are covering the Lib Dem leadership election. We have Joe Swinson with us today. We
Hello.
interviewed Ed Davey last week, and I guess we'll dive right in. So, first question, big question: how are you different from Ed Davey?
Well, there's a lot that we have in common. It's a contest between friends, and so you're not going to find massive policy differences between us in terms of Brexit and the vision that we want going forward. I think what the real differences are is thinking about if we are now looking to break through the kind of 20% figure rather than rescue the party from 8%, who is best placed to reach out to new voters? And I think that's me, across generations, right across the country, and indeed across traditional party lines, the strong relationships I have with people in other parties, being non-tribal, also the social media presence that I have, being able to reach young people, having the experience of living and working in Scotland, Yorkshire and London, and having a really high profile in the media, being able to cut through. I think those are the things which, you know, very much give me the edge in this contest.
Okay, so what? Obviously Brexit is going to be one of them, but what do you think the three headline things that the Lib Dems should be championing? As in, I'm voting Lib Dem because I stand for X. What do you think they should be?
Well, I think we should be voting Lib Dem across the country to stop Brexit, to transform our economy so that we can tackle the climate emergency and make it work for people and planet, and to harness the technological revolution. I think that's the third thing that we need to be doing, and which this place, Parliament, is spending so little time even thinking about, when it is one of the biggest issues that is going to change our country, really transform our country. Can do that for great good, huge opportunity, but we also need to get that right in terms of regulation. And so I think as Liberal Democrats, we should be absolutely positioned at the forefront of that debate. And for the last year, I've chaired the Lib Dem Tech Commission, so I'm well placed to do that.
Okay, so so the stop Brexit thing, that's pretty obvious what that means. So, but when it comes to transforming the economy to deal with the climate emergency, what does that look like to you on a policy level?
So we've obviously got a policy motion coming to conference in September on how to create a zero carbon society, and you know that actually has to happen right across our economy. We can't just do one thing in one sector. It's everything from changing the way we travel, to changing the way that we produce our foods, to changing the way in which we heat and power our homes. So right across the board we need to have those policies, which that paper, as you can imagine, does. And I think from an economic standpoint, it's things like climate risk reporting. So making sure that investors have got the information they need to assess which companies are not dealing sustainably with the way in which they operate, and therefore are a much greater risk, versus people being able to put their money into lower risk, greener companies. So I think that's the way in which we can reshape the economy, and we also need to do that not just for the planet but for people as well. So there's all sorts of regulations that companies have to abide by when it comes to reporting on their financial activities. But when it comes to reporting on their staff and how they operate within the community, the well-being, turnover, stuff around pay of their staffing, actually there's very little that they have to provide, and so those issues don't get as much attention.
Okay, and technological revolution, if we're going to lead it, what does that look like for us?
Well, I think as the UK, we should be the leader in ethical artificial intelligence. We should make that an absolute hallmark of what we do. AI is transforming so many industries right across the world. There's a way in which that can be done unchecked, which raises huge issues on privacy, on accountability, on entrenching existing discrimination and bias. But there's a way in which that can be done ethically, and we should take a lead on that. It's things like I've argued for a code of ethics for people involved in data science and coding and programming, obviously working with industry to help create that, as well as some tough regulation around issues like privacy. We've seen the EU take a lead on this with GDPR. Another reason why we should stay in the EU, of course. But we as a country, I think, can carve out that rule, showing what an ethical approach to AI looks like. And I think we should be investing in that. We have got the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation now, but it's poorly resourced. And then we also need to look at things like digital skills. So 1 in 5 people in this country don't have basic digital skills, the ability to do things like do banking transactions online, or basic public services use online. Now we should have a programme to make sure that we close that gap in digital skills, and that can be done actually relatively inexpensively. Just over £1 billion over 10 years could reach those people and make sure that our citizens have got the skills that they need to engage with the digital world, because we shouldn't leave anyone behind.
Okay, that's great. So personal questions, fun questions. If it comes up and you are running to be Prime Minister, what's the naughtiest thing you've ever done?
Well, it's somewhere in between Theresa May running through a field of wheat and Rory Stewart smoking opium at a wedding. I certainly don't think I get invited to weddings that are nearly as exciting as the ones that he clearly goes to.
Victorian.
Well, yes, exactly. So yes, I mean, I let's just say I had a lot of fun when I was a teenager, and I was pretty glad that Facebook wasn't around then.
Oh no. And the other one, if you're running in a general election, is there anything that you would struggle to answer?
I don't particularly think so, although I have to say, when I'm doing media interviews, the questions that I always sort of think, oh my goodness, what's going to be asked? It's like that fun question at the end of any questions where it's like, and if you were going to be stuck on a desert island with someone, who would it be? And the problem with those is you always kind of you give an answer and it's fine, and then 5 minutes later you go, yeah, that's the thing I should have thought of. So yeah, but no, I mean generally I think just being fairly relaxed and straightforward, and sometimes if you don't know the answer to a question, you don't know the answer to a question, and it's better to just say so.
Okay. More policy stuff. What do you think is your favourite tax, and then your least favourite tax?
Oh, interesting. My favourite tax and my least favourite tax. It's a good question. Well, I think least favourite tax, I think would be VAT, just because it obviously really impacts people on very low incomes, and so that's probably one that I'm less a fan of, just because of that. It's kind of more regressive in how it hits. Favourite tax, I mean, a lot of them are quite good. I mean, I sort of, income tax is fine. Obviously, it's sort of taxing work. I think having more things like carbon taxes are helpful, because that's helping to change behaviour. So I suppose the taxes that we have on things like tobacco, it's sort of doing two things. It raises money for the government, but it also helps to nudge people into different behaviour as well. So I think the public health benefit you get from that is quite good.
Okay. So considering Trump and Brexit and all kinds of other things, do you think the Lib Dems should be at the forefront of making the case for free trade?
Yes, absolutely. And the amount of fantasy that is talked by Brexiteers is really quite dispiriting. I saw Boris's interview yesterday on Sophie Rage, and he's kind of talking about how he doesn't think the EU countries, they wouldn't want to impose tariffs. It's like, it's not like they get a choice, right? If we're out and there's no deal and we're on kind of WTO rules, they don't have a choice about putting tariffs on. But it's almost like he doesn't really engage with any of that. So yes, I mean, we absolutely should, but it makes the case for us being able to be in organisations like the European Union, and then we need to work across deals that can be done with other parts of the world to be able to make trade freer right across the board.
Okay, another policy issue, housing. What do you think we should do about the housing crisis?
Well, we need to have huge investment to build lots more homes. I mean, that's kind of bottom line, because there's so much more need for housing than we're able to fulfill. And some of the most heartbreaking cases I get in my constituency surgeries are people who are living in entirely unsuitable accommodation. Either they're overcrowded, or they've got landlords where they're in premises that are damp and they're causing health problems for people. And yet in my constituency we have about 4,000 people and families on the waiting list, and yet each year in terms of social housing about 250 homes become available. I mean, you can do the maths, right? Most of these people are never going to get access to social housing. So we do need to deal with the supply of housing in the country. And part of this issue is actually about how property is taxed as well, because it makes sense for people to invest in property, in buy to let, because this is an asset class that isn't taxed in the way that others are. And that's not necessarily very sensible from the perspective of how can we have a proper functioning housing market for people being able to have access to homes. So we need to build a lot more homes. I do think we need to look at how wealth is taxed as well, and we need to obviously be able to make our homes fit for the future in terms of zero carbon. The Tories got rid of the regulation that we put in place to make all new homes zero carbon. That needs to be reinstated, and we also need to have an ambitious, massive programme of retrofitting existing homes to make them energy efficient, make them zero carbon. That will help us reach our net zero carbon targets, but it will also help us deal with fuel poverty, so it's a win-win.
And this is a pet issue of ours in Liberal Reform and also in the Young Liberals, the Greenbelt. Should we build houses on that?
I mean, I think we do need to recognise our natural environment is precious. And so, carpeting over it doesn't make sense. What we made a strong case for in coalition, which I think is sensible, is to look to build some garden cities, and so to find places where you can build new conurbations, that will be sustainable. So you look at places that are already on a train line, for example, and you can then build the infrastructure around it and create sort of modern areas. And I think that this has to be part of the answer. That said, it is really important that we respect the natural environment that we have. It's important for well-being. It's obviously important for biodiversity, and so that is a balance that needs to be struck. And also, what works in one area might be different in another area.
Okay, so considering that it looks like Boris Johnson's going to be the next leader of the Conservative Party, do you think it is worth reaching out to Liberal disaffected Conservatives, or do you think it's probably more worth reaching out to Liberal disaffected Labourites who are upset with Corbyn?
We should do both. I mean, we have a huge opportunity right now because there are, as you say, sort of people in other parties who share some of our liberal values, whether they have been One Nation Conservatives or whether they have been kind of Social Democrats on the Labour side, but have that underlying kind of liberal, small L liberal outlook. And they look on in horror at what Jeremy Corbyn is doing to the Labour Party and what Boris Johnson / Jeremy Hunt, frankly, most of the leadership contenders, wanted to do to the Conservative Party and the direction in which they'll take those. So the opportunity for us is huge, and that's why we do need to reach out. We do need to be open and welcoming, and I'm really proud of the way in which our party has welcomed Chuka Umunna. I mean, he joined us and he has been really made to feel at home. And when you look at things like Helen, the PPC in Stretton, the way in which she was so magnanimous, the way in which she tweeted her welcome of Chuka on the night that he joined, as I say, it bodes really well because other people are watching, how we respond to new people joining us. And I think that being a good experience is something which will encourage others.
So you talk about your good relationships with people in other parties and how that there's potentially people coming towards us. How comfortable do you think you'd be with making coalition deals with the other parties as they currently stand?
Not at all as they currently stand, because you've got a Brexiteer in Jeremy Corbyn, you've got a Brexiteer about to lead the Conservative Party, and that's just anathema to where we're at as Lib Dems when we're all about stopping Brexit so that we can then build the liberal country that we want to see. So absolutely no to any kind of coalition deals with those. In the abstract, if you like, and looking to the future, then of course we need to be open to working with others, and collaboration is the way in which we do our politics. It's it's a mature way to do politics, and actually it's the logical extension of our support for electoral reform, because if we have a more properly functioning voting system, then you will end up having probably a greater number of smaller parties rather than this sort of duopoly of the kind of Labour Conservative huge parties, which don't make any coherent sense in and of themselves. And in those circumstances, then coalition becomes just part of the normal way of doing politics, as indeed it is in most democracies around the world.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier your response to things like smoking taxes and stuff like that. So with the government seems to be reasonably interested currently in increasing taxes on different foods, like milkshakes. I think people were talking about last week, but sugar taxes coming recently. Are you generally in favour of this sort of move?
I think it's definitely got a role to play. You obviously need to assess each proposal on its merits, and also there will sometimes be sort of exceptions that you have to look at. So, looking at like fruit juice, for example, in terms of the sugar tax and so on, you need to make sure there's no unintended consequences. But, it seems to me quite a nudge way of trying to get people to change their behaviour, which can be very effective. It doesn't make sense if you find that foods that are very unhealthy can be cheaper than foods that are healthy, not least because so many people do not have a lot of money when they come to do their weekly shop in the supermarket, and so making those choices that will be better for people just that little bit easier, I think sort of goes with the grain, and is a good way to approach it.
Okay. So there's been an issue in the news recently in which two different sort of branches of liberal politics have been up against each other, and it's religious freedom versus pro-LGBT freedom. Thinking about the case in Birmingham.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on issues like that?
Well, in that case, I think it's very straightforward, actually. For me, it comes back to the rights of the young people, being educated, and the responsibility of the state to make sure that young people have an education is sort of well enshrined. We wouldn't let a situation happen where young people were able to not learn English, not learn maths, not learn those kind of basic skills. We recognise that the state has to provide that. Now, and I would say that good quality information about sex and relationships is also a key part of that. It's important from a health perspective. Young people deserve to have the information about, say, sexually transmitted diseases to be able to protect themselves and keep themselves safe. And it's important from safeguarding, so that children growing up, when we know, sadly, that the greatest likelihood of when children are abused, it's by someone they know in a position of trust. And so making sure that young people also know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in terms of touching is also vital. So again, you have to make sure that that is done in an age appropriate way, obviously sensitively, within a school environment. And in terms of LGBT plus, also, you have in every community, you've got young people who are gay, you've got people who will be in schools who have two mums or two dads, single parents. So a wider understanding that there are different types of family, and that some people are gay, and that's okay. That doesn't make somebody a bad person. It doesn't make them wrong. I think that's so important for young people's self-esteem, and every young person has that right to feel that who they are is okay, and that they can love themselves, and that they don't need to feel that they're somehow wrong. So I think for me, that rights of that child are what I put first and foremost, and that is why that education is so important, and no child should be denied it.
Okay, so you touched upon something in that I also think has broader implications, and it's about what can the government do to help women currently, considering everything that can happen to them. I don't know. Yeah.
So, well, there's a huge amount. I was Minister for Women and Minister for Equality for 3 years, as well as being Minister for Business. And, there was a whole range of different measures that we brought in, which are helpful, from gender pay gap reporting, which was the final thing that I managed to secure when I was in government, to different rights within the workplace for flexible working and shared parental leave, which is good for dads, but is also actually good for equality in the workplace. And there's a really important role that government plays on violence against women, both in terms of setting the right kind of penalties and contributing to the culture, but also making sure the support is there through things like domestic abuse refuges and support in the legal system. So those things are all sort of examples of where government can make a real difference. But I mean, the book that I wrote, Equal Power, is also all about what everyone can do to make a difference. And I strongly believe that gender inequality, which is so pervasive in our society, and actually in all societies, I mean, there's nowhere on earth that has got gender equality sussed, and it's been deeply ingrained for centuries. We all need to take action if we're gonna deal with it, because there's no way that one small government department can just solve this for society. So we all have a responsibility to do what we can, and that's why I literally every chapter of my book ended with a list of ideas of things that people can do, and we can't all do them all, but people can choose the thing that they feel most strongly about, the area where they feel they can make a difference, and do it. Whether it's just how you might have a conversation differently with a young girl that in your family, or how you might take up an issue with a major corporation that's being sexist in its advertising, or how you might campaign for better rights for women in the criminal justice system. I mean, there's literally no end of ideas of ways people can make a difference, but what we do need is people to do what they can.
Okay. So again, so LGBT rights, similar sort of issue. What do you think is more that the government can do on that issue, and then what do you think we can do socially on the issue?
Well, I mean, on LGBT plus rights, there's obviously things like the Gender Recognition Act, which absolutely needs updating, and changes in the way that the system works. Just being able to recognise people. So being able to have a passport where you're not having to have M or F as the gender, and the same on official forms. Just being able to recognise people are who they are, and they can choose to be addressed as such. So I think there's certainly areas there where that's the case. And I think on the LGBT rights as well, the education. I mean, the government's actually got the right policy that this inclusive education needs to happen, but there's still a real cultural issue. Even just the fact that this has become such a hot potato in the media, and so I think also providing leadership. One of the things that I learned as a minister is that you can also help to set that wider debate. If you look at something like portrayal in the media, existing kind of stereotyping and so on, when those things just happen, and I mean you certainly see it at the moment with trans rights in particular, it's become a bit of a live rail, that it's almost used as clickbait, as sensationalist, to kind of get people angry about stuff, rather than treat people as individuals. I mean, you get questions on, I think there was one on Question Time a few weeks ago, and it was literally something about should trans people exist or be allowed to be who they are. I can't remember the exact wording, but it's sort of like, my goodness, you're actually phrasing that as a question about whether a group of people kind of deserve to be who they are, and I think that needs to be called out and challenged, because it doesn't contribute to a positive culture where people can genuinely feel included, and that's what we want to get to. And there's a business case to make for it too. I mean, it's obviously morally right, but as a society, if we don't have workplaces and educational institutions where people feel that they can be themselves, where they feel that they're having to kind of hide part of their identity, then they will do less well. They will contribute less in the workplace. They will find it harder to get the qualifications that they're studying for, and that is no good to anyone. So enabling people to be who they are and feel comfortable in their own skin, is actually good for the country as a whole.
And within the Lib Dems, what can we do to tackle sexism, homophobia, racism when we meet it within the party?
So clearly calling it out is important, and also being an ally. And I think sometimes people can feel they might know more about one strand of equality than another. They might have personal experience, they might be gay, and so they kind of know what that's like, but they might not know so much about what the experiences of young black women might be in the party, for example. I think there's a really important point about listening to other people and learning from their experiences, and kind of recognising your privilege as well. I mean, I sort of experienced sexism in my everyday life, but I've literally never been racially abused in the street. That's just not an experience that I've had, and yet I know from speaking to friends and others that other people do. If a woman walks down the street wearing a hijab, then that's probably something that will happen at some point. Equally, I can walk through a park holding my husband's hand, and it just never crosses my mind that that's something that I shouldn't do. But I've spoken to a young guy, a friend of mine who's gay, and his boyfriend doesn't like holding his hand in public because he doesn't feel safe to do so. And so some of the things that we can take for granted that we don't think of as privilege in some ways actually are. So I think understanding that is really important, because if you listen to other people, then I think we can put ourselves in their shoes and be a better ally. And sometimes we just have to listen to what different people are saying would make things easier for them, rather than assuming that we know it all. But we do need, as a party, to monitor, to understand the proportion of our members from different groups, certainly our candidates, people speaking at conference, those who are elected to councils, to be able to understand where the issues are so that we know what steps we can take to address it.
So we've got a question from the live stream. It says, the Labour and Tories have found a magic money tree. How do we make the case for our own public spending commitments when other parties have moved far away from reality? They do like their magic money trees, and it's always, it's always tempting, and being disciplined about being credible is obviously a kind of harder path. But I think it's important that we do that when we properly cost manifestos and so on. Not least because we don't want to promise what we can't deliver. I mean, we've been there and done that, and it's not a smart thing to do. So I think we do need to have credibility in what we put forward. But I also think we shouldn't be afraid to be radical. I don't think this point in our politics is where there's appetite for incrementalism. I think people genuinely want change and transformation. So when we're assessing policies, we should be prepared to be bold. So what's the most radical policy you think we can implement and champion?
I will say quite honestly that I don't have every single answer yet, because I think we need to be very radical on our economy, but we want to be radical in a way that we have some confidence will work, rather than the kind of Jeremy Corbyn just say whatever and nationalisation is going to solve it. But I mean, so for example, there's a lot discussed about something like universal basic income, which would be radical. I've got my concerns about it in terms of whether it would end up being regressive, but there are pilots underway. For example, there's one in Glasgow, which I think we should look at. Maybe it becomes something more like universal basic services, which is another way of looking at that. And then in terms of our kind of economic model, I think we somehow need to find a way to shift from it being all focused on GDP as if that is a magic proxy for everything else, when it's not, and focus more on indicators that are close to what people really want from the economy. Because if you ask people what they want, they basically want themselves and their loved ones and their community and their country for people to be healthy and happy. And for that, we need to be tackling the climate emergency, because we want to hand on a planet to future generations. Now, in that scenario, should GDP be the be-all and end-all, or should we be a bit more interested in following the New Zealand example, where Jacinda Ardern is making well-being a cornerstone of what the economy is focused on? And I think there's a lot in that. And 10 years ago, I set up the all-party group on well-being economics. So, I think that's quite radical. in terms of a shift. And I think we should be prepared to work with leading thinkers on the economy, which I've been sitting on the Economic Council that Vince has convened, and many of those are having those discussions within the party to really shape out a radical policy platform to sit under that.
We've got another question on the live stream. What's your stance on the gig economy? What do you think about Uber and Deliveroo and
so
that lot?
I mean, I think we are moving to a world where there's going to be much more flexibility, where having one job that's 9 to 5 and doing it for 40 years, I mean, that's gone. My issue with a company like Uber, I mean, first of all, you've got technology, which is amazing, right? I mean, what it actually does by connecting up, people who want to go in a particular place with, people who want to drive them there, I mean, that is brilliant, and we ought to be able to use things like that more widely when it comes to things like how do you solve bus transport in rural areas, for example. I mean, there's something brilliant there. What Uber have done though is they've combined it with an exploitative model that basically also tries to profiteer out of reducing employment rights. And so, they ought to be able to get some economic benefit out of the having developed a great piece of technology that's really smart bit, but they shouldn't be allowed to be exploitative in terms of employment rights and sort of profiteer in that way. So that's where I think some of the challenges, and it's about then how is it regulated. I mean, the same, if you look at something like 0 hours contracts, right? I wouldn't ban them, and I, as an employment relations minister, I resisted banning them because actually the evidence shows that more than half of the people who are on 0 hours contracts like them and they work really well. But it all depends where the power is. So if you're an IT contractor and you're paid quite well and you want the flexibility, then a 0 hours contract might be brilliant for you, and you can decide when or not you're going to work. Fine. If somebody is on very low pay and they're having to pay their rent and they don't know when they're going to get shifts and they find it very difficult to arrange childcare around that perhaps, and they don't really have the choice to turn around and say no to a particular shift because they're then worried that they're not going to get offered future shifts, then that's, in my view, an example where an employer is abusing 0 hours contracts. So it should be a genuinely flexible arrangement on both sides, where both have the power to say yes or no, I'm going to take this shift and work. And generally, people should have some good notice, or if a shift is cancelled at short notice, there should be compensation. So I think part of this is how you can deal with it with regulation, and about making sure that that flexibility is done responsibly, and some companies and employers do that. And some don't, or sort of try to get away with a technological change that sort of opens up an ability to then let in some exploitation, which looks attractive because they'll make a little bit more money out of that, and they're not having to, pay holiday pay or whatever else. Well, no, you shouldn't be able to get some benefit out of that, but you should get the benefit out of genuine innovation. So I think the gig economy can work well for us. But we also need to be careful about what the rules are to prevent exploitation.
We've got this question. Does the NHS need reform or simply more money?
Good question. I've got lots of my family work in the NHS. My sister's a forensic psychiatrist. My brother-in-law and my sister-in-law are both consultants, A&E and anaesthetics. So I basically think it definitely needs more resource, because the challenges of the NHS with an ageing population are significant. We have had so much NHS reform that has been so problematic for the NHS that I'm kind of loath to say, what we need is to kind of rip it up and sort of start again, because that is also really distracting. But I do think we need to we need to be modernising the way in which the NHS works, and you see this when it comes to everything from appointments bookings to prescriptions and so on. The NHS kind of really far behind the modern world, and it needs to be able to work for people in all across the country, and help them at that point when they need help, and there are real costs to not doing that. So I wouldn't say no, nothing needs to change about it, but I wouldn't advocate a kind of massive reorganisation type programme that would probably be unwelcome and distracting, and it definitely needs more resource.
Okay. What's Ed Davies' best quality?
I really like Ed. He is a really committed party campaigner, and I've known him for 22 years now, and I enjoyed getting involved in some of the campaigns that he has spearheaded. I mean, I remember the Axe the Tax campaign, and he's obviously had a great record in coalition government as Secretary of State for Climate Change. So I think the passion with which he talks about that agenda is absolutely brilliant. And he's just a lovely guy to know. He's kind, he's compassionate, and he's a really valued colleague.
This is a question about gender pay gap reporting. What do you think about enforced gender balance on company boards, and do you think the gender pay gap reporting is working?
So the whole quotas on boards thing, I mean, I think it's really interesting that when the Lib Dems left government, that progress on getting more women on boards kind of stalled, and it showed the importance of really being on the case and having that political direction. So I would say we can probably get there without quotas on boards, but not in the absence of Vince Cable, Mervyn Davies, myself through the biz department, Helen Morrissey and the 30% Club. Then it hasn't worked so well. So I would certainly keep that option there. And I think the other thing that worked between 2010 and 2015 was that threat of quotas, because there was European legislation. So I wouldn't rule it out. Although I think that if you actually had a government that was more committed to it, then you might be able to get there. You might be able to get there without quotas. On gender pay gap reporting, I'm really, really excited about how gender pay gap reporting is working. I mean, I fought very hard for it in coalition, and we fought for it for years. And then right at the end of the government, I saw this opportunity with the small business bill, and it was like 6 weeks before the general election, and it was going to be a question of putting the Tories in a place where it would be impossible for them to just stonewall it as they had been throughout the coalition, because suddenly there would be a crunch vote, and what were they going to do? And we were able to make the case that they would lose the vote in the House of Lords, because what were they going to expect Lib Dem peers to vote against Lib Dem policy? Well, that wasn't going to happen. We weren't going to easily be able to whip them on that, and therefore we would have to vote in the Commons on it. And so I kind of did all the kind of what are the parliamentary tactics, and I said to Nick Clegg, look, are you up for the fight with the Tories on gender pay gap reporting, because this time I think we can win. And we went for it, and the Tories eventually were forced to back down because they didn't really want to have a big fight about something and be on the wrong side of it, like gender equality at work, just before the general election. And what it's delivered, board level conversations about gender inequality, and the complacency that existed in so many organisations that we do quite well in this, because we've got some women in our executive team, and we've got lots of young women coming through, and then you look at the numbers and it's like, wow. And suddenly you've got chief executives who are thinking, when I'm being interviewed, if I'm going to be interviewed on the television, I'm going to be asked about these numbers. And women in the organisations going, hang on a second, this is what our gender pay gap is, what are we doing about this? So I think what it's been really good at is sort of piercing that bubble of complacency that it's all fine. Because they were all good at doing the glossy brochures and saying that they had a women's leadership programme and doing a nice event on International Women's Day, but they were not so good at actually driving the change through. Because it's hard. Because you are working in a backdrop of a society that is still sexist. So it's definitely something which I'm really proud of.
So on that, actually, during the coalition, is that your proudest legacy from it, or are there other?
I would say my proudest legacy is shared parental leave, because it is so good for children, because there's evidence that having both parents really involved is so good for child development. It's good for fathers actually as well, because they their well-being and mental health and so on is improved when they're involved with dads. They even live longer, actually. There's evidence that shows that dads that are involved, dads live longer. And it's good for equality in the workplace. So I saw it as a strategic thing. We're never going to get equality at work while you have such inequality of the division of labour at home. and therefore making it more possible to have dads involved in the early stages is just so important. And I still get kind of thrills when people tell me that they're using shared parental leave and it's been great for them, because it's also such a special time, right? I mean, you know, I introduced it, actually I was pregnant when I took the legislation through the House of Commons with my first child, Andrew, and you know, obviously I then had him and experienced that magic of bonding with your new baby. And then when Gabriel was born, Duncan and I were able to use shared parental leave, and I mean, he thinks that he actually has a relationship with Gabriel that is different because he had more time on his own looking after Gabriel that he didn't get with Andrew. So this is it's just kind of really fundamentally important for people. We still need to improve it. We still need to you know, make more time just for dads, and we need to look at the pay. But I see it as a really important strategic step that really will be much longer lasting than most sort of policies that you might achieve in government would be.
So I think this is our final question. What's your favourite thing about the Lib Dems?
Favourite thing about the Lib Dems? I mean, what to choose, you know? Do you kind of, I mean, Minivan is really pretty good, which to anyone that doesn't know is our canvassing software. You can do it on your smartphone. I'm a bit of a fan of Glee Club. Do like a good bar chart and spreadsheet with kind of cephalogical data, and you know, our diamond posters. Yeah, I think I think my favourite thing about the Liberal Democrats is probably the people, the Liberal Democrat members. You know, it feels like a family, and you kind of go along to conference and it's like a big family gathering. And you know, all right, sometimes you get a bit irritated with one another, like would happen in any family, and there's a bit of scratchiness, but there's a lot of love there as well. So yeah, Lib Dem family.
Nice. So thank you for joining us on the live stream. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much, and thank you for listening, watching.